Hello and welcome back to another episode of What the Hack. Today's lesson will be on variables. So what exactly is a variable? Well, simply put, a variable is something that varies or changes. In programming, variables are used to store information, and then they can be referred back to and used throughout your program. We will be learning about three basic types of variables: strings, integers, and floats. A string is a sequence of characters, and these characters can be letters, numbers, symbols, almost anything you want. Strings are enclosed with either single or double quotes. In Python, there isn't a difference, so you can use whichever one you like. However, in other languages, it may matter which type of quotes you use. Integers are just like the integers in math. They're variables that are whole numbers, no decimals, and they can be positive, negative, or zero. On the other hand, variables that have decimals are called floats, or floating point numbers. Floats are often used for more precision, just like decimals in math. And just like in math, we can operate on these integers and floats. You can add, subtract, multiply, and divide, just as you would expect. But there are a few special operators I want to introduce to you as well. The first one is the double forward slash, and this is known as floor division. This is basically division, but you're only given the quotient. So for 3 double forward slash 2, the answer would be 1. Whereas 3 forward slash 2, or 3 divided by 2, it would be 1.5. So we can get the quotient of a division problem. But what if we just want the remainder? Well, there's an operator for that. This operator is called modulo, and it's used just the same as the other operators. So, to get the remainder, we would do a number modulo another number. So 3 modulo 2 would be 1, and 5 modulo 3 would be 2. The last operator I want to introduce is the power operator. This operator is represented by 2 asterisks, and you can read it as to the power of. So, 3 to the power of 2 is written as 3 double asterisk 2. Pretty intuitive, right? Now you know how to operate on integers and floats. Just remember to keep in mind the order of operations. But what about strings? Can we operate on those as well? Well, yes you can, but it's quite limited. So you can combine 2 strings together using the plus symbol, and this is called string concatenation. There's also one special instance where you can multiply a string with an integer, and it'll print out the string that many times. This is the only operation that can happen between these 2 different types. So if we type hello in quotations, and then multiply it by 3, it'll actually print hello 3 times. Now, let's do some actual coding so you can get used to these types and how to operate on them. If you guys remember from our first episode, we are going to be using Repla as our online IDE. So if you've signed up and logged in, you'll be on this page. If you have not signed up yet, be sure to sign up. It's super simple, and you can link it to your Google, so you can just automatically sign in. Super easy. And then we'll create a new Repla right here. Again, our language is going to be Python, and let's just name this one variables and create it. And once we get to this page, you're ready to get started. To create a variable, we will use an operator called the assignment operator, and this is represented by the equal sign. So what do? We will need a name. We need the name of a variable, then we press equals, which is the assignment operator, and then whatever variable we want to create here. So if you want to create a string, you can create a string. If you want to create an integer, you can create an integer or even a float. Right, so the format is this. You have the name of the variable, and then the assignment operator, and then the actual variable you want to create, and it can be anything you want. So the equal sign here is sort of like the one you're already familiar with, but I want you to think of it differently. I want you to think of it as an assignment. So this is actually saying the variable you're going to create, you're assigning it to a name. And you might not be used to this at first, but I promise this will come in really handy when you get much deeper into programming. I'm going to write the format in the comments above. Remember, comments don't actually get executed. They're really just notes for your code to tell you what it does. So the format for creating a variable, will be the name of your variable that you want to create, and then the equal sign, so the assignment operator, and then whatever variable you want to create. Oops, I am on the next line, but hopefully, here, let's just tab that over. Here we go. So this can be read as, so if you have, let's say, name, actually here, let's go back to this example here. So if we want to create a variable for someone's name, well, let's call it name, and then the equal sign, and let's just say Joseph. And this is actually read as, Joseph. The string Joseph is assigned to the variable name. Okay, this is very important. So we're creating a string, or we're taking the string Joseph, and we're assigning it to a brand new variable name. This may be a little bit difficult to wrap your head around if you have no programming experience, but you really want to keep that in mind because in the future it will really help with understanding stuff. So we can also create a number. Let's just say 5. So we've created a number 5, and we didn't create the number 5, but we're taking the number 5 and we're assigning it to the variable number. So when you're trying to read and understand this, it's sort of backwards. Yeah, but it's just for understanding. Something important to keep in mind when creating variables is the name. So when you name your variable, you really want to make sure your name makes sense. Because if you want to read your code years down the road, or if other people want to read your code, you want to make sure they can understand what that variable actually does. So in this case, name equals string Joseph. That's a good name for a variable. A bad example would be like calling a variable A and then assigning it to, Bob. So we're taking the name Bob and assigning it to the variable A, but A we don't really know what that means, and we don't know what it does. And so it doesn't really make sense. So when you're creating a variable, please keep in mind that you want to make sure it makes sense, and whoever reads your code can easily understand what that variable should do or should mean. Now that we've created a variable, we can refer back to it and use it in our program. So, do you remember the print statement from our first lesson? Well, now, instead of saying print Joseph, we can actually go print name, because this name is a variable and it's already assigned the value Joseph. So if we do this, print name, and run it, you'll see that it prints Joseph. Similarly, if we go print number, what do you think that'll print? Exactly, it will print the 5. So if we run it, 5. Remember the operations that I mentioned earlier? Well, you can also mix that in. So let's say we want the number to be 5 plus 2, right? So now number is actually going to be 7, and if you print the number, it should print 7. Yeah. So you can do that with operations. You can also do it here. So let's say we want to do, so number is 5 right now, and we want to add 2 to it. You can also put it in here, right? So this will also print 7, as you can see. Now remember, the variable type is very important, so we can't mix variables, right? So if I do this, this actually will give me an error because you're trying to print, or you're trying to add a number to a string and then trying to print it. So if we run it, it should give us an error. Yep. However, you can do string plus string. Remember, you can do concatenation. So you can actually do 2 plus 2. But what would this print? Would this print 4? Would this print 2 plus 2? Would this print 22? Well, if you said 22, you're right. Because if we run it, so a string is a literal, right? This is literally 2. And then we're combining it with the second 2. So now we have 2 and 2 together. It does not add it like integers because it's the literal version of the 2. So it put 2 and 2 together, so now it's 22. And then it printed it. So this is something important to keep in mind, right? When you're combining strings, especially if it's numbers, it might get confusing. But we can also do a more simple version. Let's remove this. We can do hello, I'll put a space, plus world. No space, and then exclamation mark. So this will actually print out hello world, right? Because we're combining it, we're putting it all together. You can think of it as, combining all the strings and just mushing them together. Hello world. This also works with variables. So if you have another string, let's say name, you can do that as well. So it'll say hello Joseph. But remember, you cannot combine integers and strings, right? This will give us an error. I mentioned this earlier, and the only time you can mix integers with a string is if you multiply it. So if we change this to an asterisk to multiply, this will be hello times 5, right? And it should print hello 5 times. So let's run it. Right, hello, 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 hello. Perfect. Now, I didn't mention the variable type floats because they work basically the same way as integers. Just know that when you're multiplying a string, it can only be multiplied by an integer. You cannot multiply it with a float or it'll give you an error. So I'll do one quick example. You can do 3.0, a float, times a number, an integer, 5. And this will work out. Yeah, so they work exactly the same as integers. They're numbers. And I encourage you to try at home the different operations, right? Especially modulo and floor division, because those are a little bit different and you may not have had experience with those before. So try it, mess around with it, mix up the numbers, mix up the floats, and also try printing strings, a bunch of strings together. I encourage you to do that so you can really get a hang of these variable types and how they work with each other. As you can probably see, when we run the program, it sort of just runs by itself and we don't really do anything. But we can actually make it so that we can interact with the program. So let me comment all of this out so it doesn't run, and I will show you a function. And this function is called the input function. So the input function actually allows the user or whoever is using the program to enter stuff for the program to use. So the format goes like this. Format for function. So it'll be input, brackets, and then inside is the prompt for user. So inside the brackets, you want to enter usually a question or maybe instructions telling the user what to enter. For example, it should be in a string, so because it prints it out. Enter a number, and then when we run it, it says enter a number. And as you can see, it's still running, right? Because we can stop it, so that means it's still running right now. And it's going to keep running until it takes an input. So I'll put 3, and once I type the 3, then we know it finishes running, because this is the end, and we can click run again. So how do we use that input? How do we use the number that I entered? Well, we can assign it to a variable, like so, and then use it later on in our code. So now our program will ask for a number. It'll tell the user to enter a number. The user will enter something, and then you'll assign whatever they enter to the variable number. Now it's very important to keep in mind, whatever they enter is going to be a string. So even though I entered 3, it is the string literal 3, not the number or integer 3. So you can actually print out something like your number is, and then plus number, right? So now after you enter a number, it should print your number is, and then your number. So let's run it and give it a test. Let's say I'll enter 65. Your number is 65. So that's how you can sort of use input to interact with the program, right? So let me modify the format. You want to create a variable. So variable assigned to an input and then the prompt inside. So this is very useful for creating interactive programs and making your programs much more interesting. But what if we want to take an input, a number, and then operate on it like an integer? Well, you can by using something called typecasting. Typecasting, you can think of it as casting a spell and temporarily changing the type of a variable just for the sake of that line of code. So, for example, if I try to do 2 plus number right now, right? Let's say I enter 3. I want to print 5, but it's giving me an error. Well, I can cast a spell and change this number into an integer, by doing this. So you put int and then you bracket around the variable you want to cast your spell on, and it'll change it to an integer for the sake of this line of code. So now when I click run, if I enter 3, it'll print 5. So to cast a spell, there's int, there is string, and there is float. The 3 types that we learned today. So this is the format for it. You just put int around any string or float, but make sure it has to be a number. You cannot cast this int spell on letters. It won't work. The string one you can cast on, I believe, anything, and it'll change it to the literal version. And float works similarly to the int. So this is how you cast a spell and change a variable type temporarily just for the sake of running the program the way you want it to. Now we can also check the type of variable by using the type function, which is just type and then brackets, and you put in the variable that you want to check. So for example, if we want to check our input here, we would put type and number, because that's where we assigned our input. And this should give us a string. It should print string. Because remember, whatever we input, whatever the user inputs using the input function is always a string. So if we run it, and I'll type 3, it tells you it's of type string. Now if we typecast our variable and change it to an integer, let's get all the brackets in place. This should now show integer, right? So let's see, I enter 3, and it shows now it's an int, or an integer. But remember, typecasting is only temporary. So if I go back and print the type of the variable, it will still say string, because we only temporarily changed it to an integer just for this line of code. So if I run it, it'll say integer because that's the first print statement, and then string because this is the second one. So remember, even if you typecast, the actual type of the variable does not change. It changes temporarily just for the sake of that line of code. We've left some activities for you to practice at home, and they're written in the description box below. I encourage you to try these activities and play around with the different variable types, the operators, and the functions that I've shown you in today's episode. Well, that's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.